Today, we invite war veteran Robin Bartlett, who shares his haunting account of his time fighting in the Vietnam War. From the tense jungle terrain to the scorching heat and constant fear, this episode brings to life the sacrifices and bravery of those who fought in Vietnam. Robin details the adrenaline pumping firefights, the camaraderie among soldiers, and the devastating toll that war exacted on both body and soul. Through his perspective, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities and moral dilemmas faced by those on the front lines, and we explore the conflicting emotions of duty, patriotism, and the harsh realities of combat. Welcome and thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah. You you have quite this story, Robin. I have gone through, some of the chapters in your book, some of the main big chapters in your book. And I'm just so thrilled to share your story with our listeners. Can you just start off by just telling us a little bit about where you're from, where you were raised, your childhood? Yeah.
Sure. Well, and the interesting thing about my book, just as a sidebar, is that I had a chance to talk to a lot of veterans, and I found out that I had some events and things that had happened to me that didn't happen to them, and so that was kind of partially the motivation for writing this book. But I come from a military background. My grandfather went to West Point. My father went to West Point. My brother went to West Point. But I turned down an appointment to West Point. My father got me an appointment. I said, no, I've had enough of the military. I went to 13 elementary and middle schools and 4 high schools, and I said, enough is enough. But in college, it was building up to the height of the Vietnam War. Classmates were getting reclassified during the summer to 1A and potentially drafted. And so I joined the ROTC program, and it was just second nature to me.
Wow. So it's almost like it's like genetic in a sense. Like there's like a whole lineage of it in your family, and when it
Our,
came down to you, it was just boom, nature.
our family took service to our country very seriously. Very seriously, we were all officers, and we prided ourselves in those words of service to our country. That was very significant to us.
Right. Um, I'm curious. So, like, we're gonna go a little bit off topic with this, but in some of my previous episodes of podcast episodes, I've spoken to guests who've had parents, fathers that have raised them that have come from this kind of a background, and they were always taught in a very sort of like raised in a very military style. So there was not much talk about emotion. There was not much like open, warmth in conversation. It was more like, this is your duty. This is what you have to do. This is how life should be. Can you resonate with that?
Absolutely. That was the case very much in my family, although not so much required to do, but as I mentioned before, service to our country was something we took very seriously. I mean, I even answered the telephone at home, Colonel Bartlett's quarters, may I help you, sir? That was how, as a child, I answered the telephone when it rang. So yeah, I was raised in a military family. We lived all over the world and the United States. And that
Right.
was kind of came with the territory.
Interesting. You mentioned that your dad was also in the military. Was he involved in the World War II?
He was. My father graduated from West Point as an engineer officer, and he was at Fort Ord, California, with the engineering battalion, getting ready to go to North Africa. But as a child, as a young boy, he was stationed in the Philippines, and this is before computers, of course. A request came down from the War Department for an officer who had attended West Point, had a scientific background, to go to Nicaragua uh, and become the commandant of the Nicaraguan Military Academy. So all of a sudden, he was swooped out of the engineering unit that was scheduled to go to North Africa and moved down to Nicaragua, which was where he spent the World War II. And then
Wow.
at the end of World War II, he had been promoted to the rank of major, but they didn't need senior officers like that, so they're going to drop him down to first lieutenant. But the Air
Mm.
Force said, you know what? We need engineers, especially civil engineers, which my father was. He was a concrete specialist. He said, we need somebody to go around NATO airfields and inspect the airfields, so because they had the jets landing on the airfields.
Mm.
And they said, if you come fly with us, we'll make you a lieutenant colonel. And he said, where do I buy my uniform? So he, at the end of World War II, he transferred to the Air Force and completed a 30-year career with the Air Force. And my
Wow.
brother was also a career officer, and my grandfather before him. So,
Amazing.
yep, military through and through.
There must be so much like pride within your family, and there must be so much just like this sense of like patriotism, sorry, is what I meant, that runs in your family.
That is the case, yeah, and to a great extent, my sons have been imbued with a strong sense of patriotism. My
Mm.
wife has ensured that they are not corrupted by my military background. None of them have
Yeah,
pursued any kind of a military career, nor had any interest, um,
right.
primarily because she said that's not for my sons, and that was fine. I wanted them to pursue careers that they were happy with.
Right. Do you think that that sort of like changed because of your experience, your personal experience at war?
It definitely changed because of what happened to me during Vietnam and in the years following. A
Right.
definite psychological and political change, yes.
Right.
Plus, my wife had a lot to do with it too.
Yeah, that helped. True.
She she does a great job of kicking me in the butt on a regular basis.
Yeah, she must have been like, okay, we're living with, the post effects of that war. We don't need to force this on our kids to potentially see that with them too, right? Carry forward. Yeah. So so just tell us a little bit about like where it all begins, like 1967. Start there.
Well, I graduated from college, and at the age of 21, being brilliant as I was, with a college degree, and I graduated as what they called a distinguished military graduate. I did exceptionally well through ROTC, and I was commissioned as a regular Army officer. And I evaluated my life and said, I've never had to be challenged very substantially. So I volunteered for the most arduous thing I could think of, which was going through airborne, paratrooper, ranger, and assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division. And I got everything I volunteered for and a lot more. And after my training, I was at the 82nd Airborne Division for about 9 months, and then received orders transferring me to Vietnam. They wanted to keep airborne officers in airborne units, so I was on orders to go to the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. But when I arrived, it was right after the Tet Offensive of 1968, the big Tet Offensive, and there had been so many officer casualties that all officer orders were canceled. And I ultimately, after about 3 days of waiting around, was assigned to the First Cav Division, and that turned out to be a very good thing in some respects because we were an air mobile division, which meant that we moved everywhere by helicopter. They had more helicopters in that division than they had in all of Vietnam. And the concept was to bring fresh soldiers, fresh troops to the battle by helicopter, as opposed to having them slog through the jungle or through the
Hmm.
area to get to a battle. So you arrived at the battle by helicopter. That was the good news. You also carried more water, more ammunition, and
Right.
less. Your packs were lighter. My pack weighed about 45 pounds compared to other officers in other units. They
Mhm.
carried 70 pounds. So
Wow.
lighter weight. The other side of that coin is that we went everywhere by helicopter and sometimes had to make, or often had to make, combat assaults by helicopter. And sometimes that was quite dangerous upon landing, especially the platoon leader, which is what I was, always
Mm.
rides in the first helicopter. And when it was my platoon's turn to lead the assault, I would be in that first helicopter.
Mm.
And even though we, had artillery preparation and Cobra helicopter gunship support, Somehow the enemy would often survive that preparation, the bombardment, and they wouldn't take out the first helicopter, they'd take out the second one. And then the
Oh.
men on the ground had to fight it out.
And
And
was that something that was quite different from what you expected? Like, did you guys prepare for it almost expecting that the first one would be hit first, or, you know, yeah.
it was known. I mean, it was the second helicopter that was always in great danger. They'd allow the first one to land, and believe that everything was going to be, the LZ was not a hot LZ; it was a green LZ. And then they'd take out the second helicopter, and it would crash on the ground. And so the additional helicopters would not be brought in; they would land at an adjacent landing zone, and then try to move to support the first landing.
Hmm.
That was
Did you
a
have to be
common
like
tactic.
interesting? And how long did it take you and your team to understand that this was the strategy that they were using and then sort of turn it around to your advantage?
It was pretty much known from the beginning. I mean, the enemy was not an ignorant enemy. They were smart. NBA were
Mm,
smart, and the BC were smart. They were good soldiers, and that was part of the misconception that many of us had. We thought they were, homegrown
mm,
soldiers, no equipment, carrying a little rice bag on their belt
mm.
with one bandolier of ammunition. And that was not the case. They were
Yeah,
very savvy guerrilla fighters, and
right.
they watched us. They knew us extremely well. We knew we were always being watched, and
Mm,
so we had to do things to subvert their intelligence of us.
right.
For example, if we were going to have an ambush, we would look at two or three different ambush locations, so they wouldn't know which one we ultimately would pick to go to.
Right, like, so a distraction technique almost.
Exactly, exactly.
Interesting, really interesting. Um, you mentioned the enemy, and in your book, I know that you mentioned that a lot as well. You just refer to them as the enemy or Charlie. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Charlie is an acronym for VC, Viet Cong, and we didn't want to call him VC. We called him Charlie. We called him other things too. I won't mention some of those names, but they were the enemy,
Hmm.
and they were good, especially at night. The VC and the NVA were the best night fighters, far superior to us as far
Mm,
as night fighters. They had an uncommon ability to be able to We would at nighttime set up a night defensive position, and they called it an NDP, night defensive perimeter. We dig foxholes, and some men would sleep and some would be awake in the foxholes. We'd put out trip flares. We'd put out claymore mines to protect us, and somehow they were always able to penetrate our defenses, and they would get into the perimeter and throw hand grenades and throw satchel charges and escape. So they were exceptional night fighters, and nighttime firefights were always the worst.
yeah. I wonder though, like, I reckon probably it's because you had the disadvantage of not knowing the location at the back of your hand as opposed to them already knowing, having a mental map of where things are, how to get around, what's the quickest routes to get to different places. Do you think, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Fighting in Vietnam was a little bit like fighting in the state of California. And we were required to stay within state boundaries, but the enemy was able to go into Oregon and Nevada and Arizona. They would come across the border, attack under ideal conditions, usually at night, and then escape and go back across the border, which we could not do. If we
Mm,
encountered them during the day, then we had superior firepower. We could bring just incredible resources to bear, jet
right.
airplanes with napalm and all kinds of artillery, as well as superior weapons and firepower.
Mm,
But they were smart and waited for the ideal times to attack us.
right. Surely, though, that could have been something the teams could have figured out. Like these are the times that they're most active. These are the times where, or were they always changing their timings that kind of threw you guys off
Yeah,
balance all the
there was
time?
there was no uniformity to them. Sometimes you wouldn't see them for weeks at a time. Sometimes you would find just individual soldiers.
Mm,
Of course, they were transport where we were, which was right up along the demilitarized zone in I Corps, which is at the north of South Vietnam. And we operated on the east coast, out around the Gulf of Tonkin, and on the
mm,
west coast, right along the Laotian border. And usually we were right there in the deep jungles of the Laotian border. It was very mountainous, thick three
mm,
canopy jungle overhead, and the enemy would come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I mean, they were driving trucks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We would
right.
bomb them, but they had the capability of just repairing. those situations, those roads, and continuing the supply chain. And our
Right.
job was to stop penetration through from that area into the northern part of South Vietnam.
Yeah. You know, you went into it initially with the idea of attack. At some point, it turned into defend. Like, just we just got to survive.
That is true, and partially that was because um, uh, our commanders were evaluated based upon body count, and after a while, it became, important for me as a platoon leader to it, to protect the integrity of my men and to place their welfare at a higher level uh, than the mission, which is not to say I did not perform the mission, but I did find I did come to believe that it was more important to take care of my men and to evaluate situations with their welfare primarily in mind,
Hmm.
and not to achieve that metric of body count.
Right.
And so I guess I probably would never have been a great commander because I didn't want to put my men in harm's way if I could avoid it.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. I suppose that there's a big difference here is you being on the front line, watching it with your own eyes, as opposed to, someone being on the back end making those decisions. It's just so much easier to be like, stay in it, keep fighting when you're not actually seeing what's actually happening. And,
well, I
and
I mean we called American soldiers grunts, and I was a grunt. I ate the same food, I wore the same uniform, and there was no way to tell I was an officer. We wore no insignia. The only way you could tell I was an officer was on the band that held my camouflage cover on my helmet. It said LT Bartlett. That was it, and that was
mm,
only a quarter inch wide.
right.
Um, but I was a target. In fact, the platoon leader, the life expectancy of a platoon leader in Vietnam was 90 days. And that was because you carried a map in your thigh pocket and the radio operator was standing right behind you within
Mm,
arm's reach at all times.
right.
So, they learned to shoot the guy in front of the radio,
Right.
which is so sometimes I had my radio operator walk in front of me. He
Yeah.
didn't like that, and the guy in front of him didn't like that either.
Right. Yeah. Um, in your book, you mentioned somewhere near the beginning, I think, you mentioned about the education levels of the soldier. And I found that really intriguing. I feel like one of the most important things, this is just coming from no experience or understanding, but is knowing what you're getting into and why you're getting into it before doing it. Do you think there was a specific reason as to why they were not training or educating the soldiers before getting into war, so like what they're fighting for, why are they fighting against?
Well, most of the soldiers that were in my unit were draftees, and they received basic training and advanced infantry training. Um, but for the most part, they were 18 and 19 years old. My platoon sergeant, for example, was supposed to be the most experienced man in the unit. Usually, a platoon sergeant has 10 years of experience, but mine had gone through a course, and it was called the Instant NCO course. And he came out as a Sergeant E6, platoon sergeant, and so he had his 19th birthday in Vietnam. So he and I had about the same level of experience. Um, and I was at 22 years of age, I was the second oldest man in the unit. The oldest man was 22. 90% of my men were draftees, 18, 19 years old. Uh, we were all kind of programmed by the Army with the training that we received,
Mm,
but education was not. I mean, there were a lot of American soldiers in Vietnam at that period of time. There were more than 50, about 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam at the height of the war in 1968
Mm-hmm.
when I went over. That was the height of the war. And they were, if you had two arms and two legs and a brain and you could hold the weapon, um, and you were eligible, they drafted you.
Mm. Yeah. I just wonder, like, person knowing that they're about to enter a war zone, they're about to risk their lives. I wonder whether they purposely picked, well, I mean, obviously young because they're fit, but at the same time, not so educated, or they wouldn't teach them too much about it purely because they're more impressionable. It's easier to, you know, draft them in. They're more likely to, maybe fall into the category of I'm doing this for my country, but without really knowing the core reason.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference today in the Army, which is a pretty much an all volunteer Army
Mm,
versus a drafted Army, where if you were physically qualified, you could be drafted. There were certain deferments, but for the most part, 18 and 19-year-olds and who may have had menial jobs or any kind of job were eligible for the draft. There were certain deferments, and everybody worked very hard to many soldiers toward the end of the war, or many civilians worked very hard to avoid the draft
mm,
and to qualify for deferment. But I would say, for the most part, I was probably I think I was the only college graduate in my platoon. And many of the other platoon leaders of other platoons were what they called OCS officers. That means they went through the officers candidate school,
mm,
and they were not college educated. So I think what you just said a few minutes ago is probably on par. It's probably pretty accurate.
right. Looking back on your experience, knowing what you do now, would you have done it all over again?
Well, hindsight is always 2020, right? There was a lot of motivation, only because of my family's background, and
Hmm.
uh, I did not wish to be drafted, and I felt an obligation to serve and to serve as an officer.
Mm,
That was kind of the family tradition.
yeah.
Um, I had today strongly mixed feelings about the Vietnam and about the Vietnam War.
Hmm.
So I find that question very difficult to answer.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would do it. I'm glad I don't have to answer it.
Yeah. Fair enough. Um, so you talked a little bit about there was this, I think, what was his name, Robert, I think, who had a really lasting impact on you. He was took on quite a senior position. One thing I really found interesting was how his he had a specific attitude throughout the whole period. He was, at least from what I understood, he had a vision, he had an idea as to how he saw it to be, and that is what got him into trouble at the end. Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of an attitude?
He was he joined our unit. We called them FNGs. That stands for effing new guy. And he was gung ho. He had gone through the same similar type of training, this instant NCO training that I talked about before, that my platoon sergeant had gone through. And he came out as a Sergeant E5, and that qualified him to be a squad leader. And the first thing he did when he came to the field was salute me. And I told him, "There's no saluting. There's no saying sir in the field. Um, I'm already a target. I don't need somebody saluting me and saying sir to further identify that I'm the leader of the unit." And he wanted to get his kills. He was gung ho, and we were always very cautious about FNGs, about these new people. We wanted them to be acclimatized.
Mm,
We wanted them uh, to adjust and learn from experience, and learn the protocols that we followed in our platoon. But he wanted to be a leader. He wanted to be a squad leader, and I said, nope, you're not going to be a squad leader until I see that you've adjusted. He went out on a patrol, not as the leader, but as one of the riflemen, and they got into a firefight. And he stood up and attacked the enemy directly with no fire support, and they shot him in the head, and he was instantly killed.
Mm.
They brought him back to me, and I in my book I call this my first worst day in Vietnam because he was my first KIA, killed in action, and I was the one who had to write the death card, attach it to his boot
Mm.
along with the dog tag, and then I wrapped him. We didn't have body bags, but we had ponchos, so we wrapped him in the dead in ponchos. I used some twine to tie the poncho so it wouldn't flap around in the helicopter wash when the helicopters came in to pick up the bodies. It's a very tough assignment. None of the men wanted to do that. Maybe there's a degree of superstition. I don't know. But it was my job, and I had to do it. And that was the first time. Unfortunately, there were several others.
Mm. Man, that's so difficult. And I can you explain this protocol, the reason of doing this?
For the first time, the Army was really attempting to identify the exact coordinates where soldiers were killed, and to record that along with the other statistics uh, uh, that where this particular soldier was killed, and that information. I don't know if it was passed on back to the family or not, but that was the case. That was what it was about.
What do you personally think about this protocol? Do you think it's a necessary step, or do you think the costs outweigh the the importance of this?
We're talking about body count now, right?
Yeah.
Well, it comes down to the age-old question of the men versus the mission and what is important. And our commanders were evaluated. These are the senior commanders. I was, of course, a junior officer. Junior
Hmm.
officers are lieutenants and captains, and senior officers are majors and above. And those officers who were in charge of a battalion or a brigade or a division, um, the metric for evaluation was body count. And it became clear to me in all of the operational orders that I received that body count was was critically important. That was how we were judged. That was how small unit leaders were evaluated. But body count meant often to me that to placing men in harm's way. And so I tried to employ techniques that accomplished the mission, accomplished what my senior leaders wanted me to accomplish, but yet did not put the men in harm's way, or at least as possible.
Hmm.
And that was I shot a lot of artillery. I was good at shooting artillery. I shot so much artillery that the artillery battalion that or the battery that supported us put a budget on me of 25 rounds. I shot what was called reconnaissance by fire. So if my unit was walking into an area and the point man, who was about 50 meters out in front of me, if he had
Hmm.
a bad feeling about what was in front of him, and I trusted him, I trusted the point men. They were, you had to trust the point men. They were critically important to your security. And I would often be called to the front by the point man. And he would say to me, I just have a bad feeling about this area. There are no birds, there are no monkeys, I don't hear any noises. So I would call for artillery, reconnaissance by fire. And so we would blow away the with a 25 round artillery bombardment. the area in front of us. So if we were walking
Mm.
through that area, hopefully we would have cleared it of any enemy activity.
Mm.
And my men felt more comfortable doing that. It was not uncommon to have them very pleased from the artillery
Mm.
barrage.
Interesting. Really interesting. So in that case, if you were being evaluated by body count, and to an extent, it's also about sort of safety. Was there a sense of pride? And I see now what you mean when you mentioned um, about how like the goal for a lot of the new the new soldiers entering is just like, I want to get as many people as I can. Was there the sense of like pride and honor, or like the sense of like, yeah, pride basically for the individual that has achieved a certain number of body count?
I wouldn't phrase it that way. I wouldn't characterize it that way. It was so grueling, first of all, to be out in the field for 4 to 6 weeks, wearing the same clothes. You had enough water to drink and sometimes brush your teeth. Uh,
Mm,
they would occasionally bring clean clothes out to you, but it was not uncommon to go for 4 to 5 weeks without wearing the same clothing. And after 3 or 4 days, people smelled pretty ripe. You got used to it, but it was grueling. It was tremendously hot. It was 105 was the average temperature, 115, deep jungle,
mm,
heavy humidity. It was a daily slog. Um, and under those conditions, it's very hard to maintain any kind of a state of or energy. Wanted to get through it. You just wanted to serve your tour and go back to the world, to go back home. Um, so that pride and that energy and that sense um, of accomplishment, defending the well, we weren't defending our country. We were theoretically protecting the United States, the free world against the encroachment of communism.
mm,
That philosophy went out the window after about the third day. Um, when you're
mm,
tired and you're hot and we had to be I had to be very cautious about the heat, because even men who were acclimatized and experienced, if they were not careful, um, I'd have men just keel over, fall over from heat exhaustion or heat stroke, and then they became a casualty, which was even more
mm,
difficult because then you had to deal with try to get a medevac in and get this man to the rear. So
right.
um, under those conditions, those very very challenging climatic conditions, life was
Mm,
tough, and it
mm,
was very very difficult to maintain any sense of pride or morale,
right.
especially with
Um,
men who had been drafted.
True. Yeah, exactly. Because for them, it was already like out of choice, right?
Yep, they didn't
That's
want to
sad.
be there.
Yeah. That's interesting because you're sort of in a sense like motivation becomes a very interesting topic, because like even working in an office job where you're getting a salary, and sometimes that grind can feel really exhausting, and you just want to get out of there as quick as possible. But in this case, it's a notch further, where it's your life, your livelihood, your entire life is dependent on that. You're in a sense sometimes hanging on a thread. And so to find that motivation to potentially lose your life for something that you don't feel so strongly about can be really hard.
Well, the training that I had in Ranger School was the best insurance policy that I could have in Vietnam. That training to this day creates kind of a band of brothers, men who share uh, the most arduous training that the Army had to offer. Now, the SEAL training in the Navy is probably more rigorous, more physically demanding, but the
Mm,
Ranger training was not only physically demanding, but it was mentally demanding. And they took you to the point of physical exhaustion and mental confusion and
Mm.
hunger, because if you didn't make your assignment for that day, you didn't get any food. So you tended to lose a lot of weight. But it was at that moment when they tested you, when they made, okay, they said, you're now the leader, take over and run the operation. So that training held me very in good stead in Vietnam. And there was never
Mm.
once, frankly, there was never once in Vietnam, even though the bullets were real, as they were not in Ranger School, of course.
Mhm.
But there was never once that I didn't feel in control and able to confront the situation. I was afraid. Don't get me wrong. When bullets start flying over your head, you are afraid. But the training helped me to make decisions, and hopefully good ones, the best ones that could be made under the circumstances.
Mm.
And I tried very hard not to put my men in harm's way. Sometimes it happened, but I also trusted my platoon sergeant and my squad leaders. I listened to them. I took their advice. I didn't always follow it, but
Mm.
that also helped me to establish that trust within this unit and to build teamwork. So they knew when the bullets start to fly, you could actually feel all the eyes of every man in that unit on the leader saying, give
Mm.
us direction, give us orders, right or wrong, but don't hug the ground and pray. And
Right.
so my training and my preparation helped me to do that.
Right.
I didn't always make the best decision, but I made a decision.
Right. Which is still better though, yeah, for sure.
Had to. You had to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you would be annihilated if you were ambushed.
Yeah, that's true. I wonder whether that became one of the like the decision making factors as well to decide like who's going to be the leader, who's capable of leading a platoon, and their ability to think on the spot in high stress situations, make decisions, and stick with it. Yeah.
Not necessarily. If you were a lieutenant on orders to Vietnam in the infantry, you were going to be a platoon leader. Um, that was your job. And
Mm.
those who were too timid or squirrely, uh, uh, they, they found other jobs for them.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
had a platoon leader had to be very cautious about being overly gung ho, because the men, especially as the war went on, as it drone on, they didn't want to take any risks. The
Mm.
attitude changed of officers and the men in Vietnam. They began to realize this was a war we could not win. This was a war of attrition. No one wanted to die for a tie,
Mm.
and no one wanted to take unnecessary risk,
Right.
which puts,
How many years were you on the field for?
well, an officer in Vietnam served for a year's tour, just as the soldiers did. But after 6 to 7 months, you came out of the field and went to a staff assignment. So after 7 months in the field, I was rotated out, and my secondary specialty was as the personnel officer of the battalion. They called that the S1. And I was understudying the S1 who was getting ready to go back to the United States. When I first came into the battalion, I met him and I told him I had this secondary specialty of being the S1, and he said, "Well, we'll make that sounds good because I'll be leaving about the same time you're coming out of the field, and we'll make you the S1 if you survive."
Imagine that. Can you tell us what is the S1? What is that? What was the
S1 is the
role?
personnel officer, the adjutant of the unit. It's a staff job, and the role of that person is to track all the personnel actions, the
Ah,
wounded, the
right. Okay.
killed, awards
Right.
and decorations.
Right.
Stateside, it's arranging parties, and
Right. Right. Yeah.
it's like
Um.
the HR department.
Right. Okay. Got it. Must have felt like heaven being there, like after, after everything you'd experienced at that, up until that point.
So I understudied this S1 for about two or 3 days. I was getting ready to take over his job,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden he came to me one morning and he said, "Did you apply for a job at division headquarters?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I've got orders here informing you to go to division headquarters for an interview with the 14th MHD."
What is that?
And I said, "What's the 14th MHD?" I had no idea. He said, "Well, I don't know what it is either." So I got on a helicopter and I flew to division headquarters, which was at Camp Evans, again up in I Corps. And I started asking around. Anybody know what the 14th MHD is?
Yeah.
And finally, I found a soldier. He said, "Well, I think it's down that trail about a mile, down that road about a mile." So I walked down the road and I finally came to a tent, and out in front there was a sign that said 14th Military History Detachment. And the motto of this unit was, "You fight it, we write it."
Oh.
And I was interviewed by the captain who was in charge. And I looked around this tent, and they had a refrigerator, they had fans, they had cots, and they had a shower. And I was offered the job, and I took it.
That was more than enough for you at that point.
So I became essentially the division historian. We attended the division briefing every night with the commanding general of the division, and they would review all of the actions that took place that day.
Interesting.
We had two major responsibilities. One was a quarterly report where all the battalions in the division would furnish a report of their combat actions as well as lessons learned. And some of them were very creative field expediencies,
Mhm.
as they called them. But occasionally, after a major battle, the operations officer of the division, that's what they called the G3, would assign us to go out to the field after the battle and interview those who were left and try to reconstruct the battle. Because again, many of these battles occurred at night,
Mhm.
and we would go out and try to interview the officers and men who were left. I would go out with a sergeant who was a photographer and artist. We would draw maps, take pictures, and try to reconstruct the battle. It was a bit like putting a puzzle together,
Right.
uh, especially at night. It was extrememely difficult to know what happened.
Mm.
Come back and write up the report. And on one occasion, we wrote up it was a major engagement. It lasted for 3 days, and one of our companies was essentially wiped out. Out of 120 men, 80 men were killed or wounded. So it was a major defeat. I mean, this company had to be pulled off the line and re-equipped, and new men assigned to it and retrained.
Mm.
So it was a major defeat to lose a company like that many men in one battle. Um, and I wrote the report, and I had actually interviewed the company commander, who was a captain. He was not injured. He lost all his platoon leaders. He lost all his platoon sergeants, most of his squad leaders, um, and his unit had been decimated. His career was over, basically. And when they had been attacked by an NVA regiment of about 500 or 600 men versus 120, and when the enemy left, they took all their dead and wounded with them. So there was no body count. There
Right.
was no enemy body count.
Oh, right.
And when I turned in the report, I indicated that the enemy had taken all their dead and wounded with them
Mm.
and escaped across the Laotian border. And the Division G3 said, this is unacceptable. We've lost a company, and you haven't put in any enemy body count. Rewrite the report and put in that we killed 460 enemy soldiers. And I said, where did that number come from? You just put it in. So I put that number in, and that was the report that ultimately was turned in.
I mean,
Uh,
this is proper fudging of numbers.
Absolutely.
And this just makes you think about, like, on a larger scale, like, the numbers that are out today that we all seem to think, are not true.
Right. It. I'm sure it occurred more than once,
Hmm. Yeah, so
but that
true.
was what I was ordered to do, and so I rewrote the report with that information in it.
Yeah.
But often, those senior officers' careers were on the line because of this situation. So that
Yeah.
was their defense.
Right. Um, you mentioned in your book as well that you yourself were injured. Can you tell us about that? And was this before or after your your um your post?
This was while I was in the field.
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, we would pick out several different ambush sites. It was my turn to lead the ambush, and we had to cross a rice paddy, and there was a rice paddy dike, and it was just one of several ambush sites that we had chosen. So there was, in our minds, there was no way for the enemy to know which site we were going to move to set up an ambush,
Mm.
night ambush, and the protocol was to send two men across the rice paddy and they check out the far side. We did so, and they signaled everything was clear. And my unit got out, walked across the rice paddy, and as we were fully exposed, they opened up on us with automatic weapons and mortar fire. And they had it zeroed in. They knew exactly where to put the rounds. I had several men killed right off the bat,
Mm.
and several wounded. A mortar round went off in behind me, and fortunately, um, it landed in the mud and exploded in the mud. So I caught some shrapnel in my shoulder and in my groin, but the mud cushioned the blow. But what happened is it knocked me backwards. I lost my helmet and I hit my head on the rice paddy dike, which was like concrete, and knocked me out. And my squad leader pulled all the dead and the wounded back to the tree line and set up a defensive position, returned fire. But I had blood all over my shoulder and my groin and mud all over the place. And I was out cold. So they put me in the dead pile. And I woke up, but by this time I had lost a lot of blood. And I sat up, but I fainted.
Mm.
And then the second time I woke up, I moaned, and somebody said, "Hey, he's not dead." And then they finally came over and put bandages on me and stopped the bleeding. But I laid there this happened at about 8 o'clock at night. And I laid there from about 10 o'clock at night until the next morning. Of course, we had reinforcements come in to support our position from the company.
Mm.
But I laid there from about 10 o'clock at night until 6 the next morning when they could finally bring in medevacs and get me out of there. And that was a very, very long night. A lot went on that night.
Mm. And the pain and all of it, like, the fear, trying to understand what's going on, like, yeah.
Well, I couldn't lead anybody. I was out of commission basically. Had a terrible headache, and when you lose a lot of blood, you become, uh, you drift into shock. And my squad leader kept coming over and slapping me in the face, telling me to stay awake so that I wouldn't go
Mm.
into shock. Um,
Right.
but it was fortunately, the once I got some blood into me, I recovered very quickly. My wounds were not terribly, you know, I was patched up, had 10 days of light duty. I wrote everybody up for awards, and then we went back out to the field.
Wow, I can't believe you actually went back into the field.
Oh yeah, right back out.
And
I was not,
how are you feeling going back into the field, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, like all of it?
well. Um, I took all those feelings. all those emotions. And because I could not allow them to affect my leadership, I could not allow them to change the decisions I had to make.
Mm.
And I likened it to I stored them all in this titanium steel trunk in the back of my mind. That's the way I thought of it. And I just locked them away at the back of my mind, and I refused to allow them to affect me.
Mm.
Um, John Wayne. John Wayne said it best. He said, um, "Courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway." And that's kind of what it was all about.
Mm.
You just had, as the leader, you had to just saddle up. It didn't mean you weren't afraid. It didn't mean you made perfect decisions, but you just had to, as the leader, saddle up and do what had to be done.
Mm.
And I did. Um,
Yeah.
I went back out. It wasn't like we fought major battles every day, right? There were
Yeah.
many, many weeks and weeks where we would just patrol and ambush and nothing.
Mm.
And then out of the blue, we'd have a skirmish.
So
It
in
might be
total in that year, approximately how many battles did you actually fight?
half a dozen, half a dozen firefights.
Wow.
And some of them were helicopter combat assault firefights. Some of them were ambushes where we were successful, where we ambushed them.
Mm.
And that was where most of the skirmishes occurred. We would have this incredible weapon called the Claymore mine, and it was a semicircular shaped charge with 500 balls. And we would put these in front of our position. This was during an ambush. And then we were back, 75 feet from the mine. And when the enemy walked into, they would be walking down the trail at night. All of our ambushes were at night. The enemy be walking down the trail. You'd wait until they got into the kill zone, and then you would fire these claymore mines, several of them, 3 or 4 of them. Nothing survived. Nothing survived. These mines spread out 500 steel balls in a 300-meter cone, 300 meters wide, 1 foot off the ground to 6 feet in the air. Anything
Oh my
within that
goodness.
cone was dead. We killed a lot of
Wow.
monkeys too, by the way, because
Right.
sometimes you couldn't tell what it was that was
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
kill zone.
It's night, you can't see anything, yeah. Wow, that's so crazy.
So that was our most formidable weapon, and often when you blew the claymore mines, you didn't have to shoot your weapon because everything that was in the kill zone was dead.
Mm. And how would you guys decide what artillery, what weapons, when to use the mine, for example?
That was my decision.
Yeah.
I there was a plunger, and it was my job to initiate the ambush. And then you blew the claymore mines, and you had men open up with their M16s to make sure that anything that survived um, was dead.
Right.
Was the object was total annihilation.
My gosh. The violence. Um, and post that, once things start to calm down, that's when you go out to check the body count.
You go out, check the bodies, look for documents, and then get out of there.
Hmm. Interesting. Did you at any point, like when you were doing an enemy body count, find anything that was really useful for you? Like, did they actually have anything on them that you could use
No,
to your advantage? No.
no. I mean, personal papers, photographs, that sort of thing. No,
Hmm. Interesting. And I remember in your book you mentioned the same thing that applies to you. If it was one of your own army men, um, KIA'd, that you would make sure that you would take all the documentation or anything that they have on them that could be incriminating for
well, in
you.
any of those personal papers would be put in envelopes and sent back to the family as well, along with the battalion commander who had would write a letter to send back.
Mm, right. Yeah.
But you tended not to carry that sort of thing. You would destroy it.
Yeah. Fair enough. Um, I want to go back to this whole not having a personal identity. I think in the book you mentioned, even with your own team, they were numbered. So you didn't really use their name. And in the same way with the enemy, you call them Charlie. I'm curious as to like, is this a way of dehumanizing the experience or disconnecting from the individual so you don't have that attachment?
Absolutely. I could not have an attachment to my men. I did get close to my radio operator and my medic and my platoon sergeant. They addressed me as 1-6, one being the first platoon leader, six being the leader. My platoon sergeant was 1-5. The squad leaders were 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, and that's how we referred to each other.
Hmm.
We had nicknames. So many of the men would have nicknames, cowboy, rock star, whatever. So,
Right.
and I just was told and informed and trained not to get close to the men. You could not afford to get close to them because there were times when you had to give orders to some of these people that put them in harm's way, and
Yeah.
I couldn't allow an emotional attachment or a friendship to change that.
I mean, I find that so difficult though, because yes, maybe you're not exchanging names or using names, but because you're spending so much time on the field with them and you're in the most vulnerable of times with these people, I'm surely at some point you're sharing part of your journey, your life. You must have known about their family back home, or like, the way that they are as an individual, maybe not their name, but there are other parts of things that they identify with. And also like in just the way they act and the way they behave and the way they look after one another in these kind of situations, you're being vulnerable with this person. So to an extent there must still be a form of attachment or some level of attachment.
Well, the answer to that is really no. Um, my radio operator, for example, was this wiry, slim fella, uh, and he carried more weight on his back than any of us did because the radios were heavy and they also carried two spare batteries. And he would complain bitterly, bitterly every day that his pack was so heavy. And one day I got so tired of listening to him complain. I said, okay, we're at the bottom of this hill. I'm going to switch packs with you, and I am going to carry your pack up to the top of the hill, and you will carry mine. And I
Yeah.
got up to the top of the hill. I gave him his pack back, and I said, I will never say another word about your
Yeah.
complaining, your bitching.
Yeah.
So there were some funny moments.
Yeah.
There were some times that you shared a laugh. Whenever we got care packages from home, and my father loved to send me flasks of bourbon. We couldn't get anything like that in the field. But my father was kind of Scotch, and so the flasks, the plastic flasks, cost him 75 cents. And he found he could get two baby bottles for 25 cents. And he could put the bourbon in the baby bottles and it would go through just fine. So anytime I got a care package, the men were always looking to see if there were any baby bottles in the
Right.
package. And then, of course, you had to share
Yeah.
share a
Yeah.
drop with everybody.
Right.
Everybody got out their canteen cup to have a
That's
shot of bourbon.
hilarious. Yeah.
So
And
there
in
were
the
some light
same
moments.
right. In the same respect, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about um other drugs like weed. You talked about weed in your book a bit. I'm curious, how was that even transported, and like how did this become a thing over there? Like, yeah.
So we would stay in the field for 4 to 6 weeks at a time, and then we would rotate in and be pull security at a fire base, big fire base with bunkers, where we could get hot food and showers, and that was pretty much light duty. You had to have guards up at nighttime, but it was
Mm.
an opportunity for a good deal of rest. You slept most of the day, but you were required to send out a patrol every day, and there was a watering hole near that fire base. And then the South Vietnamese civilians would come and they would sell cold cokes and cold beer. Cold. We got some beer and coke
Yeah.
too, but it was mostly warm.
Right.
And that's where you could buy anything, literally anything. You could, well, I don't remember that there was any hard drugs, but you could certainly get marijuana, you could certainly get weed, and they did. And, had a little plastic bag that they carried around with them. And as long as they didn't smoke it while we were on patrols or in the field, I
Mm,
didn't think much about it. And of course, there were prostitutes that came to those watering holes too.
right.
And you paid these people with military script because there was no need, there was nothing to buy in Vietnam. We were in the field, we were up in the boonies. There was
Right.
nothing to buy. You couldn't, the only thing you could spend your money on was in poker games. And they had marathon blackjack poker games, marathon games would go on for hours when you were on base camp.
Yeah.
And it was all $1 bills. So you typically got $50 a month. You had to receive it in cash, and that was the officer's job too. I was the pay officer on several occasions to pay the troops in cash for. Most of them got like $50, $75 a month, and so they would spend this money to buy weed and to buy other things.
Right.
And then periodically, the army would change the color of this script, and they would lock the base camp down, and the South Vietnamese would have tons of this old money that suddenly
Yeah.
became worthless because they changed the script.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Oh my goodness. That's hilarious. So I find it like I find it funny because in a sense you were fighting against the Vietnamese, you had enemies, but at the same time there was um, a different kind of relationship that you had with the civilians. And it was like, it seemed to be there a very clear boundary there. Like people understood, the soldiers understood that enemies are soldiers and civilians are civilians. Like we can play with them, we can, purchase things from them and even sleep with them. Right. Um, h- was there races? Like, how did the racism aspect of it play?
Well, first of all, we were in an area that was a free fire zone. So when we were in the field, not at the base camp, but when we were in the field, it was a free fire zone. So anything, anyone, anything in that area, if you encountered a person, you killed them because they weren't supposed to be there. We were not near. I was never near any village. Actually, only one occasion was I in a blocking force outside a village on one occasion, and the village was being searched by Arvin soldiers. But otherwise, I had in the field, when I was out in the field, we were looking for the enemy. We were ambushing the enemy, and we there were no friendly civilians.
Mm,
So the only time I came in contact with civilians were when we pulled base camp security, and then when I was a staff officer, and I was at a division level base camp. There were many more civilians, and that was a transition I had to make mentally, because up until that point, any Vietnamese person that I saw was potentially the enemy. Um,
right.
but I didn't have a lot of contact with civilians. I only made one trip to Saigon for 3 days, and it was
Mm,
nerve wracking because here we were driving around in a Jeep, and all of these civilians, South Vietnamese civilians, were riding around on bicycles and motor scooters. And I was just not used to being with friendlies.
right.
Everyone in my mind was an enemy. And
Right.
I had a lot of difficulty making that transition.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yep.
Have you been to Vietnam ever since?
No, I haven't. I would like to go back. I think it would be beneficial to me to go back.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the area where I was, I have no interest in
Yeah.
going back into the jungles and the boonies that
Yeah.
I humped through. I mean, that's a good word to describe what we did, humping the
Mm.
boonies. And
Humping.
that was a term we used, humping, because that's exactly what we did. I mean, yes,
Humping.
we flew from one point to the next, but then when you hit the ground, you were humping,
Right. Right. Yeah. Like literally just like chopping away. I
slogging
saw in the
away.
book, right, with the
I mean,
machetes, like
some of these jungles, they called it three canopy jungle. It was so thick, the point man could only move forward by with a machete cutting his way. We were following little animal trails. There were no roads, there were no paths, and
mm,
had to change my point man every 10 to 15 minutes because they would pass out, and the cover man was standing right behind him because the point man was chopping away. Made it
right.
very difficult if you had a man wounded in this three canopy
Mm,
jungle because there were no GPS, and you'd call for a medevac, but all they could see looking down was this jungleless growth.
right.
So we had to cut down trees with a machete and open a hole in the canopy, maybe 10 to 12 feet. If you popped smoke so that the helicopter could see you, I mean, you called in the coordinates where you were so that they could have a
Mm,
general idea, but still, that's a lot of green jungle down there.
right.
And the smoke would go up and stop in the canopy. It wouldn't penetrate the canopy, so the helicopters couldn't find you. And we
Right.
carried these things called star clusters, which was like a little bit like a Roman candle. And you take the top off and put it on the bottom, and you smack the bottom of it, and it would shoot a rocket
Right.
up in the air
Right.
about 200 feet.
Right. But that could
And
also get like trapped in a canopy, can't it?
it did. You had to be very careful about how you fired
Yeah.
it. And you just prayed and hoped that the pilot or co-pilot or one of the door gunners of the medevac saw the rocket, and then could come down, and then finally they would see some of the smoke begin to penetrate the canopy. They would drop a
Mm,
hook. Your wounded man would either sit on the
yeah.
seat, or you had to attach a stretcher,
Right.
and then they would haul him up.
So the coordinates then were not, I mean, the coordinates would give like a general direction so they would know where to hover around, but then at the end of
Correct.
the day, it's still
And you could hear the helicopters. Obviously, you could hear them, but
right.
seeing you was a whole different. I mean, that was a always a very traumatic time to try and evacuate a man in deep jungle.
Oh gosh. That's so interesting. Like this is making me think about what war would be like now. Like you probably wouldn't even have environments like you did then, but even ways of contacting and reaching out, it would be just so different now. Would are people like when they're on the field, like, yeah, do you know much about what is it like now? Like the
Well,
most recent ones as
even in
well?
Vietnam, you would fight two or three different types of war depending upon the terrain. If we were out toward the Gulf of Tonkin, there was no overhead cover. It was all sort of like grassy, tumbleweed, and rolling hills,
Right.
and extreme heat because you had no cover whatsoever. Once you stopped, you
Mm,
immediately pulled out your poncho liner and created a little tent to create some shade overhead. And then as you moved further west, you got into this deep, thick jungle. And that's where we spent most of our time. It's mountainous, constantly climbing, going up and down hills, and
mm,
searching for the enemy routes through the jungle into the supply routes.
right.
And as far as today, Afghanistan, the weapons are different, the tactics are different, but you
Mm,
still don't own a piece of terrain until you have boots on the ground. So that you may have different types of firepower, different resources, but you still have to have a soldier, a grunt, and they still call them grunts, um, on the ground to own a piece of terrain, or
interesting.
at least occupy it. You don't care. There was no need to own anything. It was
Right.
just to
Yeah.
occupy.
Right. That's so interesting. Um, I would like to move on to the here and the now. So, can you tell me like a little bit like after war, going uh, back into the world, back into the states? What was some of the stigma, or were there any stigmas that you faced as a war veteran,
Well,
especially with the Vietnam War, knowing that it was a lost battle.
uh, I got within 30 days of leaving Vietnam, and I had not received orders. And an officer fills out a form called a dream sheet, and it says, "Where would you like to be assigned?" And I said, "I'd like to be assigned to the West Coast of the United States," which meant either Fort Lewis, Washington, or Fort Ord, California. Those are the two big military bases. And I didn't get orders, and I didn't get orders, and I convinced my boss to send me to Saigon for 3 days to buy art supplies and to get my orders. And after a 3 day fun time in Saigon, I figured I better find out what my orders were. And I kept asking questions and finally went to MACV headquarters, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV,
Mm.
and went in, was ushered into a gymnasium, literally a gymnasium with the basketball hoops pulled up. And on the floor of this gymnasium were low wooden trays with 50,000 punch cards. That was the computers of the day, punch card programming.
Yeah.
And they were all the cards, each card represented a soldier in Vietnam, alphabetical. So we went down the line to A, to B, to BA, to BAR, to Bartlett John, Bartlett Paul. Here
Mm.
you are. You're going to Seattle, Washington, Fort Wainwright. And I said, wait a minute. I used to live in Seattle. There is no Fort Wainwright in Seattle, Washington. And he said, oh, yeah, it says APO Seattle. This is strange. We actually had to go to a directory to look up where Fort Wainwright was.
Yeah.
And Fort Wainwright is located in Fairbanks, Alaska. So my assignment, my next duty assignment as a regular Army officer was to go from Vietnam to Fairbanks, Alaska. I went from the fire to the freezer.
Yeah.
When I came back to the world, my parents met me, and I spent about 2 weeks at home in Monterey, California. I was away from any kind of protests. I was still in the Army. I was an officer, regular Army officer, and was separated from any civilian activity that was going on. Prepared my car to go to Alaska. You had to do all kinds of special things to your car so that it could survive the cold weather,
Mm.
and then proceeded to go to Alaska. And then in Alaska, I was in a military community, um, and apart from any of the protests, I mean, I certainly knew about them, watched them on TV, but
Mm.
I did not encounter them directly myself.
Right.
In some respects, that was helpful.
Yeah. But I would imagine though, still you feeling some type of way about it, even from a distance.
Well, by that point in time, I really had changed my opinion about the war, and really felt that it was worthless for us to have been engaged, and was extremely discouraged that the war continued,
Mm.
even though
You
our
knew well
leaders,
and clear.
both military and civilian, knew
Mm.
that this was a lost cause, and yet we continued to drag it on and drag it on. And no American president wanted to be
Yeah.
classified as the first American president to lose a war.
Right. Goes right back to what I was saying earlier as well. Like when you're not on the field, you just don't have that sense of like emotional attachment, or not even emotional attachment, but you're not seeing the casualties with your own bare eyes. So you are able to make decisions just so freely, um, and yeah, not think about the repercussions of the numbers of families being broken in the process, or whatever not.
I always thought it was amazing that Johnson was making bombing decisions from Washington D.C. as to areas
Exactly.
that we should bombard.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, PTSD. Can you talk to me about that?
So I mentioned this titanium steel trunk at the back of my mind, and it was locked down tight.
Yeah.
And after I got out of the army, it still was locked down tight.
Tight.
Um, and it affected me. There was no question about the fact that I came away um, with a lack of empathy, a lack of feelings. I was a good salesperson. That was my one of my civilian jobs, but I was not a people person.
Mm.
And after about 20 years, literally, it took me 20 years before some of these traumatic events began to leak out of that trunk. And they weren't coming back to me as nightmares. Interestingly, they came out as daymares. As I would actually experience while I was wide awake, uh, reenactment of one of these horrific events, and I would relive it while I was awake. Um, and it really started to scare me and bother me
Mm.
that these events were happening again in my mind, and as as alive and as if they had happened just then and there. I mean, they were in full detail, full color.
Mm.
There were times I could even smell the smells, believe it or not. And fortunately, I had a good friend who was a psychiatrist. I had helped her get a book published. That was my civilian career in publishing, and was in the area and went made an appointment to see her. Um, and had she gave me some very simple exercises to practice and try out, and they worked. Didn't completely go away, but I was able to live my life and not have these memories impact my day to day.
Right. Well, what were those practices? Some of the ones that particularly stood out to you. Can you recall them?
That she had me try.
Yeah.
You're talking about the psychiatrist?
Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, she would have me say to the enemy soldier that I killed, "I'm sorry I killed you. It was my job to do so. I regret that you died,
Mm.
uh, but I would appreciate it if you would just leave me alone now and let me live my life." So it was a matter of coming to grips face to face with the event
Mm.
and apologizing. And in some respects, I was apologizing to myself.
Right.
And I know that sounds terribly simplistic. And when she told me this to practice this, I said, "You've got to be kidding. You really? This is what I'm this will help the PTSD go away?" And she said, "Give it a try." And it did. Now, it didn't completely go away. Many Vietnam veterans that I speak with will tell me, and this is true for myself as well, there's rarely a day that goes by that I don't recall something that happened to me during that period of time.
Mm.
But um, the memories get softer,
And
a
more
little more
forgiving
vague.
in a sense. Yeah. And like you're able to sort of have that conversation with yourself and, see it in a little bit of a gentler manner.
Well, the distance and the time helped as well.
Mm.
Your memory is, if you allow the memory to come back, it's amazing how much detail your mind will retain. And that was one of the things in writing this book. I thought it was going to be a catharsis for me, but it brought it all back. And I
Mm.
was amazed at the detail that my mind, and many people have talked to me who've read the book and they've said, "I'm just amazed at how you could recall so much detail."
Yeah.
And it's all there. It's all there in your mind. Um, but you can repress it and you can soften it, and that's how I live with it.
Yeah. Um, when you were through the therapy process, when you were reliving those moments and asking for forgiveness, and was it like a one-time thing, or did you have to do it, practice it regularly?
I had to practice it for quite a period of time to really work through it. Yeah.
Right. And I guess at the beginning when you were doing it, it was more just an act to try it out, or an act for the sake of doing it. But at some point,
I needed to do something because it was affecting me
yeah.
dramatically, psychologically. Yes,
Mm,
I thought I was losing it.
yeah.
That's literally how I felt. I felt my day to day was being impacted by these daydreams that came back to haunt me.
Right. Interesting. In what other ways did this PTSD sort of manifest for you? Like you were diagnosed with it. Were there other physical ways that it kind of showed for you?
Well, I had a hard time, very hard time, um, reconnecting with empathy for people
Mm,
and friendships. Um, I was fortunate to have a wife who helped me through a lot of it. I wouldn't say necessarily that she understood everything, but she helped me to be a more of a people person and
mm,
to reach out to my sons
yeah.
and hug them and tell them I love you, which was something I found often very difficult to do,
Mm,
but I've gotten better at it.
yeah.
And now I have a granddaughter, and she can twist me around her little finger. You wouldn't believe.
That's adorable.
Yeah.
Talking about empathy, it actually just like triggered a memory when I was reading your book about the letters, the little snippets of the letters that you were putting into your story. Um, And I remember reading the first few letters and then later on in like the 20 something chapter, the letters then and the progression of your expression. I remember one of the first few ones, it was so filled with emotion. Like, I refuse to do this. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to let it like, sway me or stop me. And then towards the end of it, you were explaining some really dark things, but with such objectivity or such distance. Um, so it's like I could almost feel like your coping mechanism, your survival method. It was like I am now living to survive. I am not living to, you know, express and thrive. Um, do you agree with that?
Yeah. After 10 years of writing this book, and of course, I was raising a family, so I couldn't just sit down and write the book. And I had a job that took me on long airplane flights. So that's when I wrote the book. I would work on a chapter. And I literally would fall into the laptop, quote unquote, meaning that I became so engrossed in writing the chapter that I blocked out everything around me. And I was one with the story I was writing. Um, and after 10 years, I sent the manuscript out to several friends who said, "Oh, they were military." And they said, "This is great. Go ahead and publish it." But I sent it to two people, one of whom was what they call a book shepherd. She's a person I met in publishing, and her job is to help transition a manuscript through the process. And the other was just a college classmate of mine, female. These two women said, "Well, I guess you only want to sell this book to military types, right?" And I said, "No, I want this to appeal to the general reader. I want them to
Yeah.
understand more about what war is all about." And they said, "Well, you better, first of all, demilitarize it, get rid of all these acronyms. And secondly, to put, more of your personal emotions in. And that's tough. That was tough to bring back those personal feelings and emotions. But I remembered that my mother had saved every letter I wrote home, and over 100 letters, and she kept them in the envelopes, so they were date stamped.
Mm,
And I had them, put them in chronological order, and I reread every letter, which was also an amazing experience.
yeah.
And that's where those snippets came from. Uh, and you could read the story I wrote, and then you could read what I wrote home about. And sometimes there was a little bit of a juxtaposition there of the two
Mm,
stories.
yeah.
But that helped me also to put the emotion back into the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I found your book riveting. I mean, I managed to like read like 5 chapters in one sitting. I was like, I can't put it down right now. And I was at work as well. So I was like, hold on, please. Hold on. Let me just finish this one part. It was really, really good. And I just like I
Thank
can't
you.
wait for listeners to like get a hold of it. Tell us a little bit about this book, the title, and everything. Yeah.
So the title is Vietnam Combat, Firefights, and Writing History, which talks about my military. It is a memoir, but the chapters are short. And as I mentioned before, I had some experiences, some unusual experiences that other soldiers did not, other veterans have not. And each one of those stories, each one of those events becomes a chapter in my book. Some
Mhm.
of them are horrific. but there were some funny ones too. There were some funny things that unusual, crazy things that happened to me too, and so those became chapters in the book as well.
Yeah.
My website is robust. It has a lot of information. It has photographs. It has videos that I've created, reviews of the book, and a blog on topics that I've written about, my speaking engagements, and you can get an autographed copy with free shipping and save $13 off the cover price if you come to my website, which is www.robinbartlettauthor.com. And there's a female actor by the name of Robin Bartlett, so make sure you put in author
Okay.
to distinguish.
Check out the description. I'll put it in there as well for you
Thank you.
listeners. Yeah, like super, super excited to share that. And on a very last note, I am very, very curious, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would be really wanting to know about this as well. What message can you get across, or do you think that listeners need to know to better support or be more inclusive for towards war veterans, even today?
So, World War II and Korean veterans are now in their 90s and hundreds, and they're falling quickly. And Vietnam veterans are beginning to walk in their boots. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying thank you for your service to a Vietnam veteran. But if you truly want to say something to a Vietnam veteran that's a game changer, you say the words, welcome home, and you watch the reaction, because it will bring tears to our eyes and lumps to our throats. Those two words are code words and so meaningful to us.
Mm.
And so I encourage everyone to say, welcome home. Doesn't matter to a Vietnam vet or an Afghanistan or whatever the veteran is, try those two words, because you'll find a tremendous impact, much more
Mm.
so than thank you. Thank you for your service is almost like have a nice day, which is there's nothing wrong. I don't wish to say anything wrong about those words, but
Mm.
welcome home will have a tremendous impact.
Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you so much. And welcome home, really. Robin, thank you so much for today. I've had such a wonderful time speaking with you. So eye-opening and inspiring to hear your story. And I really, really appreciate you being here with us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Chris Trzynski, Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.